Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I do want to let you know that there is some discussion of the loss of a parent and the grief that surrounds that. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. Today, my guest is a creator and head writer and one of the lead actors of the ensemble cast of Peculiar Radio, an upcoming audio drama from Lengthy Tangent, of which he is also a founding member. I am so excited to have him on the show. We are going to talk about a pretty well-known television show. I think it's kind of wild that we haven't gotten this one yet as someone's submission. Yeah. Well, everyone, please welcome J.K. Robbins to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I'm very excited to have you here. No one can see this, but you are actually wearing a shirt on theme with what we'll be talking about today. And I do love that. I love that for you.
Thank you. Wearing an old. Well, have we even announced the
We have
show
not. I
yet?
was just about to say, what
yeah,
show
hold
are
on.
we talking about today? What is the thing that changed who you are?
Twin Peaks is the show that changed my life.
When you emailed and said Twin Peaks, I was like, oh, I'm actually shocked no one said that yet. I feel like it's one that is a pretty big one.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the list of episodes and seeing what shows and films and so forth had been mentioned, I was like, yeah, it inspired that, and it had elements of that and that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's so, well, I'm excited to get into it and talk kind of about like how you got into the show and all of that, because I think it recently had a reboot, not reboot, continuation, return.
Yeah, the return.
Yeah. So it's been sort of more like like people became more aware of it again recently. So I think it's a fun one to talk about from the original and everywhere else.
It's so weird the way that Twin Peaks has kind of planted itself in popular culture, and it has been growing since 1990 and finally came back to in 2017 when they did the return. Some people consider it the third season, some people consider it something different, but yeah.
Well, for people who have not gotten into Twin Peaks, seen it, or maybe haven't even heard of it, what would be your sort of quick explanation of what Twin Peaks is about?
On the surface, Twin Peaks is kind of a take on a police homicide story meets small town Americana, and everything in between, and then out of the between.
Out of I like that.
Yeah.
You've got some pretty well-known people that are a part of that show now, but Twin Peaks was sort of a launching pad for them as well, too, I feel.
Yeah, Kyle MacLachlan being, Dale Cooper, the main hero character, I guess. But at the time, he wasn't a big name. He was a favorite of David Lynch's because he used him in Dune and then Blue Velvet. But before then, he was relatively unknown, and that was his first big TV show.
Sure.
Lots of other actors that had smaller roles ended up having bigger roles after that. I mean, I guess the most famous would be David Duchovny.
Oh, yeah.
He made just a cameo appearance as a FBI agent that went undercover in drag and decided that they liked it.
Oh, okay.
And kept on going. And the network folk at Fox saw that in 1991 and decided that they wanted him to read for another FBI show that would become The X-Files. So
you got not exactly typecast, but the role of a lifetime.
Yeah, right? But let's see. Laura Flynn Boyle would end up going and starring in The Practice. A number of other character actors popped up in so many other shows. And if any show wanted to have a bit of Twin Peaks, they would actually find some of these character actors that were in Twin Peaks and put them in the show.
Yeah, I feel so. Twin Peaks was only 2 seasons originally.
Yeah. It was only 2 seasons, maybe technically 1.5. It came in on in the mid-season. So the first season's only like 8 episodes, I think.
And I think it's a short one.
Yeah, they had a full second season, but by then, David Lynch and Mark Frost didn't really have a lot to do with it because of other projects, and it kind of went off the rails. And yeah, lost lots of ratings, so they canceled it.
Which is interesting because I feel like it has such a large sort of following. Maybe I don't even know that cult following is the right word, but maybe it is.
I guess at the time, I think it was one of the first, like, almost immediate cult classic shows
Mhm.
because it had an immediate following, because nobody had seen anything like that before on network television. And when they were able to get it out into other countries, it blew up. Like,
Sure.
it was huge in Japan to the point where they would book Twin Peaks actors to promote coffee. Yeah, if you look up, like, Twin Peaks Japanese commercials, you will see some fun things. It inspired its own magazine, it had its own, series of books that kind of went along with the show,
Mhm.
um, both official and unofficial. There was even this one collection of essays, collection of, like, philosophical essays on Twin Peaks that was written by a professor at the college that I ended up going to, Middle Tennessee State University, and that person, Dr. David, Lavery, rest in peace, would go on to host lots of classes based on various TV shows, including the famous class on Buffy studies from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I was lucky enough to be a part of.
It is really cool how much there is a sort of like academia version of fandom, which I've always have found really fascinating.
And Twin Peaks was one of the first to do it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about kind of your first exploration of the show. Do you remember, like, the first time you saw Twin Peaks and how you got into it?
I'm going to give a lot of the credit for my creative upbringing and weirdness to my sister, Katie Robbins,
Mhm.
because she's 6 years older than me, and she liked lots of cool stuff and had some friends who liked some cool stuff, and they were of the age when this came out, initially when it was aired on network television live, to have been watching it then, and I was a little too young to understand some of it. I mean, hell, some adults can't even understand some of it,
Sure.
now, even after multiple viewings. But yeah, I was 8 when it came out, and it initially aired on a Sunday when, The Simpsons were airing on Fox.
Okay.
So, this was the first season of The Simpsons, and Twin Peaks came out a few months later. So, I was watching The Simpsons. My sister was watching Twin Peaks in another part of the house.
Mhm.
And then they moved it to a Thursday at 8, and I think by then, I was just, playing my Nintendo Entertainment System instead of paying attention to live television. But I knew that she liked it, and I would occasionally walk in while she was watching it and be like, "Yeah, I'm either bored or I don't know what the hell's going on." And honestly, that's, I think, the average response to anybody who walks in on a random episode of Twin Peaks.
Mhm.
I don't understand, there's no context, I'm out.
Yeah, yeah.
So when it was initially on, I didn't care. I just knew that it made her happy, so I helped make her a Twin Peaks birthday cake.
Aw.
So that was my first memory of it.
You said your sister's 6 years older. Were you kind of, like, wanting to do what she did because she's your older sister kind of thing? Or the reverse of sort of like, "That's great for you, I don't wanna do it because you're my older sister."
Um, she tried to get me into some things,
Mhm.
that I would end up getting into between 4 and 6 years later. Like, when I got to her age, then I was like, "Oh, yes, I understand now." And that's exactly what happened with Twin Peaks, because it was here and gone by the time I was 10.
Sure.
So I didn't care about anything that wasn't in front of me at the time, you know? So one year when I was 13, I went into the local shopping mall and I went into Suncoast Video and I had my birthday money and I saw the pilot episode of Twin Peaks, which was actually cut to be its own standalone movie just in case the TV show get accepted. So for Europe, they made it like a movie, and it was not rated, so I was able to buy it at
Okay.
13, and yeah, that is where it all began.
That's wild. So, they sort of went into it and were like, "We might not get a pickup," but instead of allowing it to sort of just potentially
Mhm.
beef or not, they had cut it in a way that they could actually use that as a movie itself?
Yeah. With the way that TV networks, I mean, then and now are, it all depends on who's the head of the network and who said yes, and if they're still there.
Yes.
And, the person in charge at the time was like, they wanted Mark Frost and David Lynch to do a TV series. Initially, they wanted them to do a movie about Marilyn Monroe, and that's how they got put together, and they didn't wanna do it. Um, they liked the idea, but they didn't want it to be about a real person because they
Mm,
wanted to take creative licensing and do other weird stuff.
sure, so they weren't trying to do Blonde.
Yeah, but they liked David Lynch loves the idea of, though, a girl in trouble
Mm,
because that's what almost all of his movies are about. But they went from that and were asked by the head of ABC at the time to turn it into a soap opera, and they were iffy about that. But then it kind of opened up, and they're like, "Yes, let's go and do that." Then the head of ABC changed. So they're like, "Oh, so we got the green light. We're still doing this. Yeah, we're still
right.
are we?" And they're like, "Well, let's do a half season and see what happens maybe. We'll take it. We'll see what people think of it." And they're like, "Okay, let's just shoot a pilot and then shoot a couple scenes, and then that way if it doesn't go to pilot, we could just sell it to Europe." And
Sure.
they went, "Okay." And that was the international pilot, which is the one that I bought.
So the international pilot was not aired in America in that way? It was
Correct.
okay, got it. And
Yeah.
then you as a post, Twin Peaks airing person who wanted to go check it out, were able to pick up that international pilot, and that's what you
Yeah.
watched the first time?
Um, the same time that was or around the same time that was released, the whole series was released in multiple variations. There was the first season on SP speed cassette,
Mhm.
so it was a higher quality video, but the videotapes were shorter, and that's how the first season was released. They never released the second season like that, or at least I don't remember, because then they released the whole series on EP speed tapes, so each cassette was like 6 hours.
Okay.
I would buy that shortly after I got the international pilot, because while I was watching the international pilot, I didn't realize that it was different, and then I was like, "Wait, this is the show's over. That's what happened? Oh, what? I don't remember this being a no, there's a whole series."
Right.
So that's why I had to go back and buy the series and be like, "Oh, that's what they added to okay,
To keep it
makes
going.
sense. Makes sense
Interesting.
now. Makes sense as much as it can."
So it's sort of a that it's an interesting way to have, like, kind of stumbled across it because you watched something that had a beginning, middle, and end for the story, and
Yeah.
then were sort of like, "I want more," which seems like that's what they kind of accomplished as well when in the production process.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but also in the same vein, like, when the pilot episode aired, once that pilot episode ended, you're left going, "What did I just watch?
Mm,
Can I see more of that? I think I want to." Like, it was one of the first shows to kind of create the water cooler effect,
mm,
like, outside of I mean, at the time, Dallas?
okay.
Like no, seriously, it was the "Who Shot JR" effect.
Right.
It was who killed Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
That was the question that they marketed,
Mhm.
from the very beginning, "Who killed Laura Palmer?" And in a small town like Twin Peaks,
Right.
y yeah,
Yeah.
so everybody wondered, and they stretched it out until the network said, "Answer the damn question."
Tell them.
They didn't want to because they were like, "Well, but that's kind of the goose with the golden egg there."
Right. That's sort of the
Yeah,
end of the show.
or the golden goose, yeah.
The golden
The
goose
goo
who's
gold
laying eggs.
golden I
Golden
yeah,
I don't know.
the golden the goose that lays gold eggs.
There you go. I think the eggs are golden, the goose is normal.
In this
Uh,
case, the eggs are chevron, and, they speak backwards and, have a very dark mystery, that needs to be solved.
so with something like that where you're sort of kind of setting up a something that should have a pretty easy answer, like you brought up how many different shows have sort of like been influenced by it, and you've got sort of like the true detective of it all. You've got quite a few actually that can come after that.
I didn't even think about adding True Detective to my list, but, I mean, literally, they had not a oh, This is gonna work on so many levels. They didn't have a doppelganger. Um, they didn't they kinda had a doppelganger 3 months after they aired in the show Northern Exposure,
Okay.
which was a more family-friendly and much more grounded, version of it. Picket Fences, a show for teens called Erie, Indiana.
Mhm.
Um, then The X-Files helped kind of take that and then add so much more to it that would then kind of open up a whole other can of sci-fi worms.
Sure.
Carnival on HBO, was kind of like a Dust Bowl version, including some of the same actors. Passions, like, Twin Peaks itself was lampooning, in a way, soap operas, like
Mhm.
daytime soap operas. They even make fun of daytime operas in the show, but then a show like Passions was a soap opera that was kind of lampooning Twin Peaks. Um, Psych, Riverdale, using some of the same actors, Bates Motel, Gravity Falls for Disney. I
Mhm.
mean, and then video games like Alan Wake and Silent Hill.
Oh, it's so interesting that you bring up Bates Motel because I would not have thought of it as a sort of a Twin Peaks,
it's just the small town darkness and, weird elements. Like,
yeah, it's definitely there, yeah.
the creator of Bates Motel, like, I just remember reading that, they were like, "We wanted to make Twin Peaks, but with, you know."
Yeah, no, and that I mean, and that show too is I actually think it's one of the best shows in recent years that have been made, and not a lot of people watched it, which is unfortunate, but, it really does have that same, um 'cause you it basically took Psycho and did
Yeah,
add the small town element to it, like you're
yeah.
saying, which
Ooh,
is what makes it so good.
Lost.
Oh, okay.
Lost, Wayward Pines, the dream elements of Sopranos,
Mhm.
and even, Donald Glover says that he wanted to make Twin Peaks with rappers for Atlanta.
Oh, interesting.
And in the first season,
I
there are
see that.
definitely some elements.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that for sure. Yeah, that's so it's interesting because when you think about the sort of, like, small town, something's not right here
Mhm.
element, it does seem like Twin Peaks was sort of the I mean, it's always hard to say someone was the first to do something, right? But it does seem like Twin Peaks was sort of one of the more popularized, groundbreaking versions of it that then trickled down into so much that we have now.
Well, I think the writing, like Mark Frost's writing, and the characters that he and, David Lynch created were so unique and likable that it was definitely the first one that was accepted by such a large number of people at the same time. Because
Mhm.
I was thinking about this before, the interview, like, what other examples of, there's something not quite right here in perfect suburban Americana
Mhm.
were there. And the only thing that I could think of, at least around this a similar time, was the Joe Dante film The Burbs
Okay.
with Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks was coming right off of Big, and they wanted just something kind of dark and comical, the white picket fence, but also the Charles Manson
Mm.
cult, like,
Sure.
in the same space. And I remember that movie, but barely. Like, I vaguely remember that movie.
Yeah.
Remember it being kind of fun just because Joe Dante did the Gremlins franchise, and Gremlins 2 was hilarious. But it did not really sit well with people. Like, it was like, "Oh, it's kind of like Cable Guy before Cable Guy was Cable Guy," where it's like, okay, you take America's favorite kind of comic actor and put him in a dark comedy and see what happens.
Mm.
People just leave going, "Nah, that doesn't work. I want him to dance on the piano again." Um, so, yeah, The Burbs didn't really stick with people.
Sure.
So 2 years later, this happens, and it's like TNT, just
Yeah.
everybody fell in love with it.
What do you think was the thing that they were able to do that the Burbs or things before it weren't that made it work for people so much?
It's the perfect storm, to be honest. The visuals, David Lynch's nightmarish art house visuals, Angelo Badalamenti's just beautiful, haunting, and sometimes jazzy soundtrack, and then just characters that you, even if you don't like them, you're intrigued by them.
Mhm.
And then this underlying feeling of weird that you've not experienced before, I think unlocks something in your subconscious because it's something weird. It's something that you don't understand. But if you can get an inkling of understanding, it makes you unique. It makes you different, and it makes you feel good because of that. And I think that this was that first TV show that unlocked that feeling of saying it's okay to be weird. And it did it for millions of people all at the same time.
I really think that's interesting because one of the shows that you talked about being influenced by Twin Peaks was Lost. And we did an episode on Lost a little while back, and Faith, who was the guest on that episode, described the exact same feeling of people trying to solve a mystery together, of when you started to figure things out, when things were weird and you connected with those people, you sort of felt like you were in a club of something exciting. But for you, it sounds like most of your experience with Twin Peaks was after it was already completed. So were you connecting with that feeling on a sort of singular level by yourself, or were you connecting on that with sort of the trailing group of people also getting into the show as well?
A little bit of both.
Mm,
Like, I definitely watched it by myself,
mhm.
until I tried to get other people to watch it with me. And I was like, "Oh, you have to see this. This is" like, I
Yeah,
was that guy who had that one thing, and I'm like, "I'm just gonna champion the hell out of this,
yeah.
and I'm gonna try to get as many people introduce this to as many people as possible because I think it might open up their minds to the weird," you
Mhm.
know? And I did a fairly good job of it. I mean, I think Twin Peaks itself is like the springboard for David Lynch's films
Yeah.
because it's the most accessible, because it's not just David Lynch solo, it's David
Sure.
Lynch and Mark Frost. Uh, a lot of people think, "Oh, Twin Peaks is just David Lynch." No,
Yeah.
it's David Lynch and Mark Frost, the guy who created Hill Street Blues and Mark Frost. Like, he has he's of the TV mind,
Mm,
the keeping the story going, extended storylines, having all the characters come together and be kind of a part
mm.
of the same thing. And David Lynch can sometimes go in weird directions and go in deep directions that some people can't follow
Sure.
him with.
Yeah.
But no, it's springboard for his style.
Sure.
And honestly, if I hadn't had seen Twin Peaks first,
Mhm.
I knew of the name David Lynch. I knew of Elephant Man and Dune as adaptations that were kind of like, weird.
Right.
So I would have eventually found Blue Velvet, and Blue Velvet is essentially almost a prototype for Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is if Blue Velvet were made for network television.
Okay. Yeah.
Almost exactly. It's about small town Americana, the darkness that's underneath it all, and lots of beautiful velvet curtains and jazz music. Only in Blue Velvet, they're blue, and in Twin Peaks, they're red.
Well, when you did start watching it, was there, like, a moment or a character that you can kind of zero in on, and you were like, "That's the moment I was hooked"? Because it sounds like you had a couple of run-ins with it before you finally did hook yourself into the show.
Yeah. Yeah, when my sister was watching it, nothing really grabbed me.
Mhm.
But again, I was 8, and I saw a few seconds and went, I don't understand." When I initially watched it again, like, for the first time, the International Pilot, obviously the hero, Dale Cooper, he's this handsome FBI hero who is literally the symbol of good.
Mhm.
You know that something has made him this way, but you don't know what or how. That's what the show is supposed to kind of provide at some point. Does it? Kind of. Um, but he is this almost, I don't wanna say he's the everyman because he's beyond he's just the good guy.
Mm.
He's just the good guy. He's like if Don Draper were, uh, you know, kind and good in every way and not at all decaying from all of the consumed vice. Um, but yeah, the same reason why people like Don Draper is the same reason why they like Dale Cooper, even though Don Draper is like 20 years later and people are like, "Oh, yeah, okay, no, I definitely understand now. But I'm still gonna root for you. You're such an ass, but
Right.
I'll root for you. You look good in the suit and your hair. Keep saying cool things, man." And I think, Dale Cooper was the Boy Scout version of that.
Mm. Yeah. So the sort of not exactly anti-hero, but with
Yeah.
the same sort of archetype of it. That's interesting because it's sort of like you're saying the parts in Don Draper that you look at and say, "Oh, I see underneath the bad parts of you. There's something interesting there," and so it's sort of the muddied version. The something interesting that you see underneath is just what's up front for this for Twin Peaks. Like you're saying, that character sort of just has the goodness that you're sort of scraping away later to get to.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like Dale Cooper Dale Cooper is, at the beginning, pure, and if you watch the show, then you realize that he's not as pure as you think.
Hmm.
But why took almost 26 years later for the 3rd season to kind of explain a little bit about.
So would you say it's sort of like the reverse, like with Mad Men and the Don Draper archetype that you're mentioning? That's sort of, here is this guy that you should not like at all, and as we go through, you sort of scrape away the badness to find something interesting. Versus what you're talking about with Dale Cooper is sort of, here's this Boy Scout good guy that you definitely should like, but something's not exactly right, and you're sort of scraping away through the show to get to the answer as to why.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's
Yeah,
interesting.
it's weird how Mad Men is a incredibly sauced, Vice Laden version of 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 that.
Yeah, you sort of it's just sort of a
Yeah,
flipped,
kinda
yeah.
turn it around and
Yeah.
pour a lot of scotch on it.
And a couple cigarettes, couple packs
Yeah,
every 4 days. Um,
yeah.
Good lord. What a time that the
It got
'50s
me
were.
into coffee, I will say that.
Twin Peaks or Mad Men?
Twin Peaks.
Twin Peaks got you into coffee?
Mad Men got
I was gonna say
Mad Men
Mad Men,
got
I
me
don't really remember the coffee in Mad Men.
Mad Men got me into scotch. No, no, Twin Peaks actually got me into coffee because my parents drank it, and I never liked it,
Mhm.
and then I watched it, and I was like, "Why does Dale Cooper drink his coffee black?" And then I drank it, and I was like, "Okay, there is something here, but I don't know what it is yet. I'll
Oh.
figure it out one of these years." And then my taste did change, and then I ended up working in coffee shops for, like, forever.
With Dale Cooper, would you say that's the character that you were connecting with the most as a sort of mirror, or someone that you related to, or is it just someone that you found interesting?
It was the character that I found interesting because at the time, again, being so young when I watched it, you have heroes in cartoons that are,
Sure.
like, obnoxiously Boy Scout about things, like Leonardo from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like that.
Right.
But Dale Cooper had, like, a worldly knowledge about him, about why he did believe in these things. Like, it wasn't just, "Do it because it's right." It was it it was like, "Do it because on a philosophical scale as people, there's no reason why you should be doing anything different.
Mm.
Like, this is what is good. This is what is right for everybody." I don't know. That might be romanticizing it, but
No, but I think there are those characters that are, especially as a kid when you're starting to watch like adult characters and you're looking for something you can connect to. I think a moral center is really interesting as especially as that moral center starts to be taken out of like the cartoons of, we are ninja fighting turtle people that that have a clear evil doer to deal with, versus something that becomes more I wouldn't I guess Twin Peaks is
gray.
close to reality, but it's not without its unreal reality
Yeah.
elements. But seeing like it's more about the moral center of people and how that can be complicated, I think is an interesting transition from sort of cartoons to what we would now just like talk about as like peak TV, so to speak.
Well, and it does deal with those elements of, good and evil,
Mm,
light and dark. Like, there's the Black Lodge, which is, this nightmarish room. It's a beautiful room. It's black and white chevron floor
mhm.
with the red carpet. And, as I hold up the mug of the Black Lodge, you can't see it. You can just trust me, I'm holding it up, and there's coffee in it, so that's where it's almost like a purgatory in a way to evil.
Mm,
And then based on later in the show, and you find out that there is also evidence of a White Lodge, that's where all goodness goes, this, that, and the other.
yeah.
And then, the battle for people's souls is a recurring theme, especially in the end of the 2nd season and in the prequel film, Fire Walk with Me.
Mhm.
That turned off a lot of people because it wasn't quirky, happy-go-lucky. It was messed up. It was the stuff that couldn't be aired because of standards and practices
Mhm.
on network television, and yeah,
Yeah.
like, it brought back some of that seediness from Blue Velvet and, Frank Booth cranked up to 11.
Well, so one thing I'm curious about is, as we said, as you mentioned, there's sort of been like multiple times where you were like, I don't think so, I don't think so, and then you got there. When you finally did find that the show connected with you, you said you were that you were about 13. I'm curious, like, what was going on in your life at the time when it finally did connect?
Um, because I've at least have watched the first 2 seasons and Fire Walk with Me multiple times, multiple times, multiple times since I was 13. At the time when I initially had it, like, when I initially bought it when I was 13, maybe 14, I was living the quintessential basically, the surface level of Twin Peaks and of Blue Velvet, the
Mhm.
quintessential just middle-class suburban, childhood.
Sure. What part of the country were you in?
Nashville.
Nashville.
I'm
Okay.
I'm in born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Haven't left. Actually, I tried to leave. Went to Boston, actually. Went to
Oh,
Boston.
okay.
I looked into Emerson. I did not get into Emerson.
Fair enough.
Um, but I went to Boston University for, a year and then got crazy homesick and, decided to move back. And at MTSU, that's in a town called Murfreesboro, about 40 minutes outside of Nashville.
Mhm.
Yeah, lots of parallels in that small town and in Twin Peaks and the small town and everything else that I've consumed since then. Um, so small towns kind of stuck with me,
Okay.
but I digress. At the time, childhood, suburbia, I was like, "Oh, I get it. Oh, there's some dark stuff going on. Okay." And then my life was hit with a traumatic event. I was in a car accident that was unfortunately, fatal for my dad,
Mm.
and, that kind of trauma and the experience of loss hit me in a whole new level.
Yeah.
So, that underlying darkness and then the themes of, loneliness that some of the characters feel later on in the 2nd season, and then even in the prequel, Fire Walk with Me, that hit me in a whole new way,
Yeah.
and I think endeared itself to me for good after that.
Yeah. The thing I think we've talked actually, it's something that comes up a lot on this show. And I don't know if it's necessarily because of my own grief or because of just the fact that it seems like media becomes this connective tissue when you're going through something like that, where it gives you a sort of peace. But I am always interested in the idea that sometimes what you're watching at the time or the thing that you find at the time can start to help you either process or find comfort in something that remains the same. So every time you watch Twin Peaks, it's going to play out the same way. You're never gonna watch an episode of Twin Peaks and find out like, "Oh, this time they decide not to do what they do in this episode every time." Um, and and for it to be something that's so sort of, like, close to the life you were living as well in that small town, Americana kind of space, did you find that Twin Peaks was giving you maybe, when you say it, like, endeared itself to you at that time, was it giving you something that was steady, or was it giving you something that was kind of helping you think through what was going on? You mentioned sort of, like, now you're aware of this underlying darkness of your own life.
There are things that a little bit of both. I mean, there are things in the show that will always be comfort food for me.
Mm,
The soundtrack, the music, it's beautiful. It's uplifting. It's sad. It's uh, loungy. It's nightmarish. It's ethereal. Like
yeah.
I listen to it a lot still. And in 2011, when David Lynch really started getting into the possibility of maybe returning to Twin Peaks, he would release an MP3 file of music that was not released on the soundtrack, like every week. There are hours of the different takes that they did for the soundtrack that he ended up collecting, and you could download on the website. I don't know if it's still up there, but yeah, I've got the soundtracks. I listen to them on the regular. I try to find music that was inspired by Twin Peaks because something about it is comforting, and it just feels good, despite the fact that it is on the darker side
Sure.
of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But I like, moody jazz music. As far as what happened and how the show kind of helped me through some things, um, like I said, one of the reasons why, I say Dale Cooper in the beginning when I was a kid, it was because, oh, he's the hero, he's the good guy. I'm
Mm.
supposed to root for him. And then later on, you know, no spoilers if you haven't seen Twin Peaks, but
I think it's been long enough.
I think the show's been out for a while, guys. That the reason that he was such a stand-up character is because he couldn't save his fiance or
Mm.
wife, I don't know at the time.
Yeah.
He couldn't save her,
Mhm.
and that grief is something um, that he carried with him, and that was the one thing that made him imperfect, is that he tried to the girl that he meets later on in the second season, he tries to save her and then, I guess, falls in love again.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, and that meant that he was weak. So he let his guard down and his soul was taken. Anyway,
Mm.
there's a better, smoother way of describing all of that. And for all of the hardcore Twin Peaks fans, I do apologize if I just jumbled something up. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. What's interesting about that is kind of the idea that this character that you were relating to at the time, or not necessarily relating to, but interested in, was sort of driven by something that once you find it out, it sort of puts everything into place, which is that he's holding on to his grief and an attempt to sort of there's always that I don't know that survivor's guilt is the right term necessarily, but the idea of
I could
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
could see that.
of just sort of like I always find that tension of you couldn't save this person and
Yeah,
as a really interesting thing because I do think it is a big part of grief because it's not something that really is like a fair assessment. What were you like? Yeah, you couldn't save someone, but it's not necessarily something that you're expected to do or that you should have to do. But you have that sort of weight of I'm here, they're not, and I think it's that's a feeling that you don't understand how it affects you until it happens, and seeing a character that's playing out the reaction to that without knowing that that's what they're reacting to,
yeah,
until it's revealed later is a really specific kind of portrayal of that grief, I think,
mhm.
um and it's just, I don't know that I have a button on that. I just as you were explaining, I was like, yeah, I think that is it's I guess maybe what it is that we very often do see characters that you're able to see sort of like actively reacting to grief, but we don't
Mm,
get a lot of sort of storylines that show you the impact of grief remaining and even after you continue to live your own life and how it kind of affects your character going forward.
yeah. I mean, I've seen some, uh I mean, this is gonna sound ridiculous because I can't back it up, but I know that I have seen some shows in the last handful of years where the character is effectively being affected by grief, though trying not to be.
Yeah.
They do exist, and I watched it, and it affected me because I feel the same way sometimes, and I definitely have felt survivor's guilt for many years. I just didn't know that I did,
Yeah.
until therapy. Um, and and probably not enough, but that's why I watch Twin Peaks over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's the same.
Um,
Same thing.
yeah, I think that people are finally writing grief in a more realistic way that they didn't necessarily go into that in
Mm,
Twin Peaks,
yeah,
and they sure as hell didn't do that in most of the shows in the '90s,
yeah.
um, which is another reason why it was such a landmark show because it came out literally in the first half of the '90s, and it still hit on things that it took other shows at least a decade to catch up to.
Yeah, I think one of the shows that I can think of that did it recently, and it's not, it's still a recent, like, grief event, but you're watching characters, trying to, like, not deal with it, essentially, like, it's affecting them, but the main character is sort of moving on, which is, The Bear that was on FX,
Ooh,
yeah,
ooh, okay. Yeah.
yeah.
The bear not just dealing with grief, but dealing with working in a kitchen.
Yeah. Which is its own chaotic moment.
Oh my god. I was a cook for 6 years, and, yeah, that triggered me. That show triggered me on various levels.
Very
Great
fair.
show,
Yeah, great
and I'm
show.
definitely looking forward to the 2nd series, but whew.
Yeah, very I remember the pilot of that show is maybe the most stressed I've been in a really long time, and I, have never
Yep.
worked in a kitchen. So it's,
Mm.
it was stressful enough as an onlooker.
That show needs trigger warnings.
Yeah.
If you've been in the food and beverage industry, or even if you haven't, and you have a higher level of anxiety than most people, you may need something to get you through this episode.
You are going to need a stiff drink
Yeah.
to make it through the pilot of that show. Yeah, but I think, it's interesting what you're the thing that you bring up of it this was in the '90s. So, I think earlier you said, like, the closest thing to, like, water cooler television was Dallas. And Twin Peaks is dealing with very different, sort of content than Dallas is, and I wonder if that's part of why it's lasted as long as it has, where you're able to have these moments that, where you can look at it now as, like, an adult and say, "Okay, like, I when I was watching it as a kid, there was just the element of small town relatability. I get that, I see it, and I understand it, but now as you go through life, you can say, "Okay, well, it depicts the aftermath of grief in a long-term fashion. It depicts, um, sort of this good guy and moral center and unraveling that and where those things come from, and it almost seems like as you've watched it throughout life, you've started to find more layers in it, even though it's only 2, maybe 3, depending on your feelings about 2017,
Uh,
seasons in a movie."
uh, well, and also just the escape from whatever is causing you pain.
Mm,
Um, Laura Palmer in you don't really see how deep she goes into this weird dark world until the Fire Walk With Me movie. But, yeah, you have this character, Laura Palmer, teenage girl, middle class suburbia, escaping the house at night to go do drugs and get wasted with older people because that's what made her feel like an adult. Because the home life was a nightmare. You just don't know it until the prequel that kind of unraveled all of the happiness in the TV show, which is why I think everyone who saw the movie hated it at first.
mm,
Now it's being hailed as a classic. When it first came out, everyone, for the most part, just critics destroyed it, terrible at the box office. Nobody liked it because it took what they loved and then opened it up more and
right.
dug deeper into it. And, with the show on ABC, you could dig a little deep and you can get a little real, but you're not gonna go all the way down to the bottom.
Sure.
And no one was prepared for it.
Mhm.
They didn't wanna think that was happening to their characters that they loved for 2 years, but, that's canon
It did
and
happen.
more realistic than not,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Something that, I think it just sounds like a recurring theme of Twin Peaks is this idea of like happy and what's underneath
Mhm.
that idea. Um, and I'm thinking like very much a predecessor for like Stepford Wives, as well, where you're thinking about
Which Stepford Wives, though? I only
that's
say that just
true.
because, the original one was from the '70s.
That's actually true. I obviously, as a self-centered person, was only thinking of the one that came out when I was
The
alive. So
Oh, the latest one, Don't Call Me
oh,
Darling,
yeah,
with,
the complete
the latest
remake of
Stepford Wives?
yes, oh
Yeah.
my god. Um, that's another rabbit hole for us to go down if but this idea of sort of like even Desperate Housewives, which is more of a soap opera element, not really like it doesn't have the sort of different elements that Twin Peaks has of the corruption of it. It's really just people being people.
Yeah.
But the idea that like America idealizes this white picket fence happiness of a family, and that is quote unquote the American dream or the American ideal, the American family, and that it's not possible for that to exist without people still existing underneath. There is no
Yeah.
sort of like go to the office, come back home, everybody has dinner, and you sort of just like power off. Like it's not human.
Yeah.
And that corruption is where the interesting part is. And so it's interesting that sort of like almost like the standards and practices of network television kept it in a place that it was still comfortable enough that the
Yeah.
second you got out of it and could really understand the underlying and explore the underlying things that exist in those spaces where you're sort of putting that mask up of that American dream, that's where it became too scary for people or too
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
I mean, they in the show itself, they definitely hinted at things, and they showed it to a point,
Mm.
but, they're just like, use your imagination," and then when the prequel movie came out, David Lynch was like, "I'm gonna show you it all," and, that was not the imagination that people wanted to see. Um, but again, like, when they were pitching it and they had the pilot, they didn't like, the people at ABC didn't think it was gonna fly. Like, they would get 1 episode out and then cancel it, which is why they shot those extra scenes and added them onto it. And they're like, "Well, if we really seriously wanna pitch this, we need to show it to some of the younger, producers and execs and see if they can do something with it." And they were like, "Yeah, this is great. I've never seen anything like it. This is gonna be what everyone's gonna talk about." So, you know, that's why they went with it. The only
Yeah.
thing is, it's Pandora's box or David Lynch's box in this case. Once you open it, you might not wanna see what's inside always.
Yeah.
Um
For something as influential as Twin Peaks, JK and I absolutely needed a two-parter to get through everything. We'll be back next week with the second half of this episode, where we'll continue to discuss the influence Twin Peaks had on media moving forward, how the show impacted JK himself, and how it influenced his own taste as a creator, and a little bit more about his upcoming audio drama Peculiar Radio, and how it explores similar themes as Twin Peaks. Tune in next Wednesday for the rest of our conversation. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.